Introduction. This video is a conversation with a Christian anarchist on the topic of nonviolent protest and resistance and its utility to anarchism. In particular, we are discussing the recent work of Erica Chenoweth, they, them, and Maria Stephan. Chenoweth and Stephan's book, Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, was published in 2011 and has dominated the literature ever since. So, would you mind introducing yourself briefly in whatever detail you feel comfortable with?
Sure. No, my name is Jonathan.
Same
I
as
would
me.
call myself a Christian. Yeah, I noticed as well. So, I would consider myself a Christian anarchist. I'm also a syndicalist based in Sweden or living in Sweden. So I also wanted to say that like the paper that I wrote is more of an essay. It's not really an academic paper.
Okay.
So it's not peer reviewed and it probably won't be. But like I bring up some of the same criticisms. I, even though I came to the conclusions myself by reading the work that some academic papers also have brought up. So I mean, there's a sophisticated debate around the Chenoweth paper or Stephan and Chenoweth paper, and also like an activist debate about this work. So basically the background why I wanted to write an essay is that I've been involved in civil disobedience. I've been involved in nonviolence work, but also more a multitude of tactics approach. So I have a vested interest in evaluating nonviolent tactics. I think it's a very important work, and but I reacted to some very how to say far-reaching conclusions from the Chenoweth paper. So some
Okay.
of the things that have been reiterated or often brought up is the claim that nonviolence would be twice as effective as other
Right.
forms of
Right.
resistance. And also this claim that if you have
So 3%. Yeah.
3.5% of the population, then that would be enough to topple any government, basically.
Yeah.
And I think those conclusions are far too far-reaching, and I'm not really sure how much the researchers behind the paper are really like propagating those either. I've heard Chenoweth and Stefan like um, bring up those numbers, but I also think if you read their paper, I haven't read the book. I only read the paper that they based the research on,
Right.
and I don't think they make those far-reaching claims in the paper. So
I
it's more
see.
something that's been coming from civil society and groups that are very involved in making nonviolent work seem superior in every single way.
Right. I'm really interested to have you say that because those are 2 points in particular that I've been wondering about as I've been reading Chenoweth and Stephan's work and also reading the critique. I doubt that I'm as widely read as on the subject as you, which is why I really value your perspective. And of course, as you're aware, and a lot of members of my channel would be aware, I'm also a Christian anarchist, and my faith community is theologically in the Socinian tradition, typically regarded as the rationalist Christian tradition,
Hmm.
and also, and particularly relevant to this discussion, we are also in the historic peace tradition. We're not one of the great
Hmm.
historic
Right.
peace churches, but we are in the historic peace tradition of Christianity. And we are
Hmm.
known for that. We have resisted involvement in war and protested against war as early as the American Civil War and also both world
Right.
wars and the Vietnam War. And in particular, some of our members have had significant experiences with the government in this regard. In fact, one of our members in, I believe, the First World War became the test case for conscientious objection to military service in Canada. And as a result of
Right.
his steadfast refusal to join the military, despite undergoing severe punishments under military discipline and being
mm,
forcibly enlisted and being physically abused, he refused to serve, and this actually established legal precedent for conscientious objection to military service in Canada. So at least we have that to our credit. In
mm,
Nazi Germany, a number of our members were arrested for failing to serve and were jailed, and I believe at least 2 of them shot for refusing,
mm,
even on pain of death, to be enlisted in the army. And of course,
mm,
during that time, and even prior to the Holocaust, in fact, we were involved in the kinder transport, helping to get
mm,
the Jews out of Germany. And in fact, one of our members even wrote to the government prior to Hitler coming to power about the danger, what he saw the danger in Mein Kampf. Actually, literally wrote to the
mm,
government and tried to get them interested, but of course, Britain at the time
mm,
was very much on the appeasement track, so it didn't really get anywhere. But at least we have that to our credit. And then I remember,
mm,
when I was growing up, of course, I was born in 1973, tail end, obviously, of the Vietnam War. But I grew up with
mm,
people, members of my community, who had refused to be called up by the Australian military or the Australian government
mm,
for service in the military, and had to face court and end up either paying fines
mm,
or face a prison term. It's been the same
mm,
in South Africa, where our members refused to serve in the South African military or police force and were consequently, jailed. So we have,
mm,
I'm very invested in this from that perspective. It's
mm,
part of my theological background. Now, I will say, having said that my community is not strictly pacifist. And
mm,
that is actually a point made in our literature, even going back to our earliest
mhm,
times. We are not pacifists. We would believe in civil disobedience, absolutely. And we take
mhm,
scriptural warrant from that, as you'll be aware, all the passages in Acts for a start.
mhm,
And so we believe in civil resistance to government authority, and we believe in passive resistance, and we believe in non-violent resistance. But we definitely believe in resistance. So
mhm,
we're not pacifists, and we do also believe
mm,
in the exercise of violence for self-defense, either of our person
mm,
or those whom we are protecting.
mm,
So yeah, now personally, speaking more personally here, I have about 3 generations of armed service in the military in my family, on a couple of different sides of my family. Since my early members of my generations of my family didn't belong to the same faith tradition, they were either Anglicans or just not religious at all. So I had a great grand uncle or something who was in the Somme, and I served in the First World War, and then my grandfather was in the British Navy in the Second World War, and my father, on so that's my maternal grandmother, my maternal grandfather, and my maternal great grand uncle, and then my own father was in the Australian Navy before he became a Christian himself. He was originally a kind of a nihilist.
mm,
He was actually a member of the Australian Communist Party too. I grew up in a
mm,
pretty lefty household. He
mhm.
became very disillusioned with the communists after the whole, the Hungarian thing and the Czech invasion and all the rest of it.
Ah, yeah, right. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, for a while he was literally a card-carrying member of the Communist Party, which eventually, of course, got him thrown out the Navy when they found out. He never
Mm,
served, but he didn't see a problem with it, at least at the time. Later on, obviously, he did. So I have a personal interest in this theologically and also, well, literally
mm,
personally. My generation in my family, funnily enough, on I think both. Oh, yeah, that's right. My father's father was a member of the British Artillery in the Second World War and served in occupied Germany and served and lived in occupied Germany after the war as well, which is where my father was born.
mm, mm,
So I'm theologically and personally connected to this issue, and I have very strong views on myself.
mm,
Now, I am in an awkward situation in Taiwan where, as a foreigner, I am not permitted to engage in civil resistance or
mhm.
technically any kind of protest movement. Now,
Right.
if like a handful of 30 foreigners want to walk down the street holding a Black Lives Matter flag, the government doesn't care because they see that as completely a non-issue, nothing to do with them. If, on the other hand, I was involved in a protest regarding a government decision, even challenging a government decision, yeah, I could legally get deported. I'm not even sure exactly what my position would be if I supported the protests or protest in favor of changing the gay marriage legislation, which was changed after a lot of protests recently. I'm not even sure exactly how I would be treated at that, although it wouldn't stop me being involved. And I have been involved, technically not involved, in the sunflower protests, for example, a few years back, protests against the government. They were political protests against the government, and I attended those nominally, at least, with my camera as somebody who was doing photojournalism. And a local journalist friend of mine actually gave me his business card and said, "Look, buddy, if anybody stops and asks you why you're there, just show him my card and say, oh, yeah." And I'll say, yeah. He's taking photos and video for me. He's my stringer. Don't worry about that. Yeah, he's just taking video for me. So then you'll look employed, and we'll do it that way, which is very generous of him. But yeah, I was there. I would have had very little excuse when, for example, I followed the protesters after they broke into the grounds of the executive Lien, one of the Taiwanese government. Yeah, you probably saw the video. Yeah, I was there as they were breaking down the gates, and I had that moment of, what do I do now? Do I step over and go with them? And I did, and I thought, well, I'm just gonna risk it, and so I ended up with the rest of them in front of a row of riot police at the end of the night. Although at that point I left. So yeah, I've taken. I mean, I'm prepared to take risks in that regard, but yeah, at the same time, I do try to be sensible. I've always support Indigenous protests, and I've attended plenty of those outside the parliament. But again, let me tell you, that is not a matter of bravery on my part. The government takes one look at oh dear, those irritating Aborigines again, doing their stuff. Okay, a couple of foreigners with them. Oh, it's not a surprise. They don't really see them as a threat. So I'm not representing that as any groundbreaking kind of dangerous protest on my part. The government just sees them as an irritation largely, which is enormously frustrating actually. But yeah, I'm not going to get rolled for that. But I still think it's important to be there. So those are my personal and theological reasons for being not just interested in this, but personally invested in this. And I'm particularly interested, as I mentioned, in your probing of those two key points. And as you said, I mean, I have Chenoweth's book, and I read the paper first, then I went to the book. And like you, I especially even after they wrote some replies to some of the criticism, I was like you, kind of scratching for where some of these claims came from. It occurred to me that there has been a certain academic mythology built up about their research.
Yeah.
So if you can shed any insight into how that happened,
Sure.
I'd be very interested. Perhaps
Yeah.
for
Now,
the benefit of our viewers, maybe you could just give a brief introduction to what this is really about.
Okay, yeah. I don't remember the precise title, which feels a bit unprofessional, but so Chenoweth and Stephan are two political scientists, and they wrote this paper called, I think it's why civil resistance works.
Yes, that's right. I remember.
Or why nonviolent resistance.
That's right.
Yeah.
That was the first one.
So you'll have to bring up the title in the video so everyone can find it.
Yeah.
But they are reviewing hundreds of cases of resistance against government authority, trying to achieve some kind of change through different means, either a significant degree of violence or a significant degree of nonviolent resistance.
Right.
And they are using they're using statistical methods to evaluate these different conflicts, and they come to the conclusion basically that and here they are clear, I think, that basically civil resistance and nonviolence are proving to be more effective. So that's the conclusions they make. Then I don't think the numbers are off that evaluating their work, taking them at face value, and reading them very literally, you could say that, well, uh, this proves that civil resistance and nonviolence is twice as effective as violent methods. But since they are scholars and political scientists, and I also studied political science
Right.
back in my student days, uh, they are not saying that, well, nonviolence is always twice as effective. They're a lot more careful. They're saying that, well, we have done this work. This indicates something. We can say that we have these results, but I don't see them doing these far-reaching conclusions. Then again, when you are doing activism, when you're doing political work outside of parliament, then it's hard to have these kind of very fine-tuned and careful academic positions. It's more effective to have talking points. And I think that's where the issue comes in, that when you're using this work as a talking point,
Yes.
then it becomes false, basically, because there are problems with the work that they did. And that's not saying, like, I read a criticism recently from Peter Gelderloos, who
Yes. Yes.
uh,
I Yeah.
what I did
I've
in
read his work on nonviolence as well, which I
Mm,
have very strong opinions on. But yeah, I'll let you continue. Sorry.
yeah, I think he had of good points as well, and I think that all of these points need to be addressed by civil society and nonviolent activists. Uh, and there I see that's actually what I tried to do in this essay as well. I tried to ask that question that, well, Gelderloos brings up these problems with nonviolence. What would be like, and contrast that to what Chenoweth and Stephan did, and ask the question that, well, when we want to change society for the better, when we want people to be more free, uh, how do we do that in a strategic and reliable and credible way? What kind of methods are credible and what strategy is credible? So I think that's a really important question to ask, and I think that's where the debate should be at. But I don't think the debate should be just defending the work of Stefan and Chenoweth and saying this is the answer. I think that's an important part of the debate, and the
Right.
debate should include that. Uh, it should include a criticism of their methods, and that's also what Gelderloos did criticize their methods. Now, I think he's also falling into this trap of the activist
Yeah. Yeah.
perspective, where you want talking points, and
Right.
he's not seeing the value and benefit of the work they did. And I think he's too uncharitable towards them
Yeah. Yeah.
in his criticism. So I can send you the link to the article where he criticizes them as well,
That would be
and
great.
you can put it up in the show notes, I
Yeah.
guess,
Excellent.
because I think that that would be very helpful to have a discussion that includes all these different perspectives and asks, well, when we're working on the streets, what do we do? What do
Right.
we actually do to improve the situation of ourselves and the situations of others?
Right.
Um, and there I think Chenoweth and Stefan have helpful points and helpful insights, but I don't think reiterating this point of, well, civil disobedience and nonviolence being twice as effective, because
Right.
the reality is so much more complicated, and I think Chenoweth and Stefan agree to that point.
Yes.
So, and
Yes.
being pushed on the issue, I think they would agree to that point. I don't know them personally or have talked to them or anything, but reading their work and evaluating their work, I don't think it's so. Yeah, I don't think they're so defined or so set in their conclusion.
Mm.
But then again, I think it's also, I mean, there are different, also concerning nonviolence and civil disobedience, there are different interests in that regard as well. I mean, there are peace activists who are all who are very involved in the idea of leaving states be and leaving states to define their own path in life or in their history. For example, I'm very critical towards the discussion around Syria,
Right.
that the Assad regime should be left alone and not criticized for their actions, where some actors within the broader left are basically saying that, well, states should determine their own future, and we should not criticize states more than any other actors, and other states should not get involved in
Right.
the business of other states, basically. So
Yeah.
that's leaning towards the position, but I'm also very critical towards, for example, the Gray Zone project,
Mm.
uh,
Yes.
that I think fall into this category and
I completely agree. I mean,
are
you would know from my recent videos how I feel
yeah
about that. Yeah.
yeah yeah. So yeah, I'm trailing away and I'm losing
No,
my
that's fine.
thought
Actually,
line here, but
yeah, this is a good
roughly. So
that was very helpful, and this is a good opportunity for me to raise another point. I believe one of the major criticisms leveled at the Chenoweth and Stephan research is this arguably contentious issue of how do we actually define nonviolence?
hmm
And that's an issue which I know Chenoweth and Stephan have spent a bit of time discussing, and I believe
mm
particularly in their follow-up work, they've talked about this distinction to be made between, say, passive resistance and active resistance, and
hmm
civil resistance and violent resistance and non-violent, and exactly what do we mean when we say non-violent resistance or even non-violent protest, particularly given
hmm
the fact that by some definitions, every act of protest is essentially a form of violence, right?
mm
So
mm
how do you understand them defining non-violent protest or non-violent resistance?
I
This
don't
is particularly
basically.
important given the
Yeah.
historical examples
Mm.
they cite, right? For example,
Yeah.
I find that anytime anybody wants to say that nonviolence doesn't work, as soon as you point to
Mm.
someone like Gandhi or Martin Luther King, they will point
Mhm.
to edge cases in the protest and say, okay, that wasn't nonviolent. But at
Mm.
the same time,
Mm.
if you point to something else, they'll say, oh, yeah, yeah, and
Mhm.
they'll change to kind of fudge the definition.
Mhm. Yeah, so basically the other day we had an incident in Sweden with a racist fascist politician, or I shouldn't say fascist. I don't know his politics enough to do that, but definitely racist, who wanted to burn the Quran in a small
Right,
town in Sweden, which caused an uprising among local youth, I think, in
right.
particular. And well, of course, the papers here, they are very they want to have the story of
Right.
violent clashes with the police and so on, and they bring
Yep.
up
Yep.
these examples. And I don't know enough details from it, but I think it's a good example that at the same time there was a priest
Yep.
who protested by ringing the church bells in order to
Ah, I
disturb the
see.
process,
Yep.
and he's now facing fines and punishment for his action. And I saw some videos from activists involved in the protests, and you see that a lot of them are not rioters,
Yep.
but there are riotous events happening as well. And I think that's interesting because, like, regardless of the ratio between like so-called violent and so-called non-violent protesters, there's always going to be this issue of the media wanting to present things in a sensationalist way.
Yep.
And that's I think one it's a helpful example because, like, when you look at the civil rights movement in the US, when you look at Gandhi's resistance and so on, of course there were incidents of violence there as well, but they are lifted up as paragons of nonviolence.
Mm.
uh, of course there were significant and maybe a majority nonviolent elements in those movements, but I wonder if, like, nonviolent resistance isn't that always more common. You see that
Yes.
in Russia
Yes.
and Ukraine today with the war. You see a lot of nonviolent resistance towards
Absolutely. Yeah.
the Russian regime, and you see it towards the war in Ukraine as well, like actively involved in the fight with the Russian army. There are people who are using non-violent tactics. You've seen this amazing footage of, for example, military vehicles being pulled away with tractors. Some of them probably true, some of them probably not, but it's still an example, and that's where it's very difficult to draw the distinction between violent and non-violent resistance. Now, in and here Gelderloos brings up this point that, well, when you're using statistics, it's a very blunt instrument. Of course, Gelderloos in his criticism isn't that charitable, but I think that's the point you need to bring away, and I think it's a correct point that when you're evaluating resistance as violent or non-violent, it's very difficult to draw those distinctions. Should you always just look at, like, what are the majority of people using? How would you even know that in a very, like, when you have the information that you have? I recently tried to, like, verify the people or the figure of people killed in the Vietnam War, and
Yes.
that's very difficult. Like, how many people died from US aggression in Vietnam? And you have the official stats from the US, you have the official stats from Vietnam, and I mean, it's not even comparable.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, and I ended up with, I think that 1.1 Viet Cong were killed and 1.3 civilians were killed. But when you look at what were counted as Viet Cong in that instance, uh, when the war was happening and the US was actively fighting in Vietnam, I mean, basically everyone counted as Viet
Right.
Cong
Right.
because
Yeah.
that was a convenient way to say that, well, we can bomb this village because it's a Viet Cong village.
Yes.
Was everyone Viet Cong in that village?
Yeah.
Were the kids Viet Cong in that village? And that's a problem with the Stephan and Chenoweth work. I mean, they also conclude that statistics and statistical methods are blunt, and that's why they have this quantitative method to contrast the
That's right.
statistical work as well.
Yep.
Now that becomes a problem in itself, and that's also something that Gelderloos raises. I need to refer back to that because it's one very distinct criticism of their work. Um, but when you have this corpus of 300 plus cases of conflicts, uh, I would guess that most of them involve both violent and non-violent methods. And Stephan and Chenoweth say that they have carefully evaluated and made a distinction based on what was the most like prominent aspect of these conflicts. But that's not very. I mean, it's very hard to know because you would have to look at every single case, and you would have to look at what they did and see how did they evaluate these conflicts. And I think every single point of conflict could be a contentious issue in itself and
Right.
could be
Yeah.
discussed in infinity. So that's also one of the points where I think it's important to see that, well, they did some valuable work, but now we have to keep studying and keep looking at it and keep discussing, and also keep this discussion alive combined with the work we do on the streets, organizing in the workplaces, and so on.
Right. I want to talk a moment about the implications of a non-violent protest for a movement which believes in revolution, and obviously
Hmm.
for a topic you mentioned previously, what happens after the revolution. And I think that's very important. But
Hmm.
before we move on to that, can you tell me what you think are, at least broadly speaking, the reliable takeaways from the Chenoweth and Stephan research, insofar as you
Hmm.
can say there are any?
So reliably, I think what you can say is that it's not wrong to say, and here I don't think that Gelderloos would disagree either, even as let's say their harshest critic,
Right.
um, that civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance can work.
Yeah.
It can be an effective method in a circumstance where a social movement deems that that is the most effective way of resistance. I think when you look at Israel and Palestine, there are amazing examples of nonviolent resistance from the Palestinian side
Right.
and from the Israeli side against the conflict. and against attrition.
Yes.
Uh, and where some social movements, and not all factions in the conflict, but some social movements have concluded that this is the method that we are going to use. This is the most effective method. So I think that's one point where I would agree with Stephan and Chenoweth and say that, well, this is not proof of very much, but it's research, and you don't in social scientific research you don't often prove anything.
Yeah, of course.
You
Right.
argue for and you find support for positions, and uh, I think Stefan and Chenoweth's work is a good support of the position that nonviolent resistance can, in some circumstances, really work.
Good. Okay, great. That sounds fantastic. That's very good starting point, I think, for anybody who wants to approach this subject. I think that's a reasonable conclusion myself, based on my own reading, and more importantly, on the subsequent papers I've read which interact with their data. Now,
Hmm.
getting back to the issue of what happens after the revolution,
Yes.
I think that one issue with violent revolution is whether or not, well, the extent to which it's considered valid to continue to use violence as a political and social tool after the revolution. And
Hmm.
I think that for all the talk of the utility of violent revolution, I'm really concerned about what happens afterwards. And we have some fairly good examples here. Well, take the USSR, for example. You have your violent revolution, and it's successful, and you suppress the bourgeois, and you establish the dictatorship of the proletariat. However, as Marx, Lenin, and particular Stalin mentioned, if you want to keep it, well, of course, that means you do have to repress the reactionaries. So, of course, you repress them and you jail them, etc., etc. And of course, then the next thing is, well, you probably didn't get all of them, and even if you didn't, then maybe there's always going to be some discontents, and you do need to do something about those. Well, of course, you can't really do anything about them unless you know about them. So probably a good idea to have some kind of spy network or secret service which can actually monitor people and just keep an eye on what people are saying and doing, and then you start to establish that system. And then, of course, there's the question of, well, once you do hear somebody saying something which is politically inappropriate, or perhaps you think might be an unworthy criticism of the government, what do you do with those people? And of course, well, maybe you could argue that you don't want the rot to set in, so probably best to nip it in the bud, and you want to just take those people out and put them somewhere where they can't infect others. And so then of course they might have spoken to some other people, so you better take in those people as well. And then little by little you end up with this oppressive authoritarian regime. Eventually you have to be increasingly oppressive to protect this system. And I'm very much of the opinion that a kind of a, a revolution, or some kind of system, authority, or system, or society which is based on the idea of it is legitimate to take power violently, is always going to be vulnerable to the next lot of people who decide they want to take power violently. So what do? Oh, well, that's okay. We'll suppress them. Well, in that case, how are you not different to the last lot of people? If the soon as you say it that political violence and coups are a legitimate method of regime change, then you open yourself up to the next person who wants to replace you through a violent coup. And what are you going to say? What are you going to do? What are you going to complain? Oh, no, you're not allowed to coup against us. We get to decide the legitimate coups. Well, I'm sorry. I think once you've opened that door, you can't close it. You've legitimized that in your own action. And frankly, I think that, this is mentioned in the literature with regard to instability in Africa, Marxist-Leninist regimes in Africa have historically been unstable for this very reason. That once you establish the idea that, hey, everyone in our society, if you get a bunch of people together and enough guns, then your regime change is legitimate. That's how we're doing it these days. It's okay
mm,
to change regimes through as many people as you can get and more guns than other people. That's how we're
mm,
changing regimes these days. What do you think is
mm,
going to happen once you legitimize that? And then there's
mm,
arguments over whether the Russian backed coup was legitimate or the American backed coup was legitimate.
mm,
It doesn't matter anymore. How can you possibly
mm,
establish some kind of democratic and socio-politically stable regime change system if this is how you've decided to do things? What do you expect is going to happen?
mm,
And if you're saying that, oh, well,
mm,
voting doesn't work, but this certainly does. Well, yes, it does. But how, once you've
mm,
legitimated that as a tool, or legitimized that as a tool, how can you deny that the use of that tool by others? You see what I mean? So this is why I see the utility of non-violent resistance beyond
mm,
the revolution,
mm,
because
mm,
post-revolution, ideally, the society should be based on non-violence rather than on violence,
mm,
because the anarchist objection to the state is
mm.
specifically its violence.
And I mean, who likes violence? No one likes violence, not
Right.
real people anyway,
Yeah.
because like even if you ask soldiers, and then I mean people who are doing soldiering, they don't like violence
Of course.
because they know what it looks like.
Yeah.
Uh, if you ask like generals and people who are only looking at a war on paper, they might end up practically liking violence, but yeah,
Or,
and
maybe
sometimes you find people who are
theoretically
romanticizing.
liking violence.
Yeah,
Yeah, because
yeah,
of their distance from it.
but if you push them, they would probably also say that no, well, violence is a necessary evil,
Mm.
which most people also agree to when pushed to the extreme. Um, I think it's important to look at here. You could also make a case which I think is valid, where you look at, for example, the Russian Revolution. What would the Russian Revolution have been had it not been faced with an invasion from abroad
Right.
in its
Right.
early history? Would a paranoid leader like Stalin have been able to rise to prominence? And here I'm not knowledgeable enough by far, because it's a very complex and intricate history, and where you would need to look at specifics and so on. So I think, like, I agree with you to a general extent, but then it's also um, I think there would be ways around it if, like, a violent revolution is the only possible option or viable option. I think it's interesting to look at some recent Maoist uprisings. Um, for example, I think the recent uprising in Mongolia by
Right.
Maoist factions, if I'm remembering correctly, and here I'm not really safe with my assumptions, but I think they actually relented power and said that, well, we overthrew the government, but now we need to have a liberal process to evaluate the path forward.
Yeah.
And some Marxist guerrillas who have been, yeah, so Colombia would be another example with the FARC guerrilla,
Yes. Yes.
who changed paths from a guerrilla movement towards more of a political party.
Mm.
And also from an underdog perspective, because it's a lot of the work they did was not very popular,
Right.
and
Yeah.
also some of the tactics they used
Yeah.
were morally very
Questionable.
dubious.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Would you
and
say
of
Sinn
course that
Fein?
made
Would you
them
say Sinn
unpopular.
Fein's another example? Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And I guess that's also a part of the lesson learned from what you're saying, that, well, if we only have a violent revolution and we suppress any dissent in the future towards the revolution, then we end up with an authoritarian oppressive system, and that's not really what we wanted in the first place.
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
so in my essay, I asked the question, what would be a viable and credible strategy for changing society in a liberational way with nonviolent tactics? Because I think, like, I prefer nonviolent tactics. I would
Sure.
describe myself not as a pacifist, but as a critic of violence. So a
Yes. Yes.
violence critical position, which is a term that I sort of invented myself. I haven't heard anyone else use it,
Sounds great.
but
I'll start using it.
what I would put in it is to say that, well, violence is always evil, and if you say that violence is a necessary evil, it's very easy to forget that it's a necessary that it's evil,
Evil,
even though
yes,
it
yeah,
might
I
be
know what you mean.
necessary.
Yeah, yeah.
So why not exhaust every other possibility before resorting to violence?
Mm. Yeah, and
And I think most people would agree to that as well, that violence should always be the very last option. But what I would like to bring to the table is that, well, if we agree to that, then we have a lot of options before we resort to violence.
right, exactly. And the question I was asking and the points I was raising about Marxist-Leninism
Mm,
and the concept of the violent political coup um, are obviously by no means theoretical. We know that partly from historical experience,
mhm,
but also I had in mind particularly the paper that I'm sure you're well aware of by Engels on authority, his 1872 paper on authority, in which he critiques severely the non-authoritarian socialists. And of course, we can guess he had in mind
mhm,
particularly the anarchists. And he said
mhm,
he makes the case for not just authority, but specifically hierarchy in society. And he says it's necessary. So he's explicitly saying that authority, which he defines as the imposition of a will on somebody else, is a natural and functional and necessary part of society. And obviously, he defends a hierarchical society. But not only that, he makes the point that, as he says, a revolution is about as violent a thing as you can imagine, event as you can imagine. And how do these non-violent socialists presume to maintain their non-violent stance when they not only start from the
mm,
point of a
mm,
violent revolution, but they
mm,
intend to maintain that revolution? So he says, first of all, you've used your violence to set up a revolution. And secondly,
mm,
how can you avoid the use of violence if you wish to preserve the
mm,
results? So this is obviously not
mm,
by any means a theoretical issue, no, and obviously the topic has been raised before. And Engels'
mm,
argument is that yeah, you continue to use violence, and as I
mm,
said, that is precisely my concern, because I think that the
mm,
outcomes of authoritarian Marxism or
mm,
authoritarian socialism in its various forms haven't been great.
mm. So what if I can continue to develop my thought on
Yeah, that would be
nonviolent
great.
revolution? I agree with you, and I think it's a very good point. So I just wanted to move on. Um, what I ended up after writing this paper, I asked this question, and I kept thinking about it myself, and I slapped myself on the head because I thought I'm stupid. How can I not remember that? Like, I'm a syndicalist. Of course, the general strike. That's a viable and
Right.
credible way of overthrowing a government or changing society through nonviolent means. But then we come to the next issue, which is general strikes very often face violent repression.
Right. Right.
And what do we do then? And that I think is a very difficult point. And that's also where I contacted you in the end, because I
Mm,
was inspired by the actions in Hong Kong and the
yes.
idea of this Taoist tradition of being like water and mimicking water.
Mm,
And I was thinking that, well, maybe there's something there which you could really develop on and really use.
yes. Yeah, and I think that's a very valid point. Obviously, that has parallels with, as you know, the Christian tradition of nonviolent protest as well. Interestingly enough, that idea of the general strike is raised in some of the classical anarchist works in response to the
Mm,
question of, well, what do you do when the factory or the commune or these other federated groups doesn't agree with you or doesn't hold up their part of the bargain or uh, doesn't serve the community in the way that they've pledged to? What do you do then? And the response
mm,
given by, I can't remember if it was Proudhon or Kropotkin, it was one of them, said, well, you withhold your labor. You refuse
mm,
to cooperate. And obviously, this places them ultimately in an untenable position, or at the very least, is going to significantly impair them. But of course, as you said, the next question is, well, what if they come into your factory with guns and things like that? Well,
mm,
then things have already got to another level. But I think this really raises the issue of after the revolution, you need to ideally develop a different culture. Is it not a priority to develop a culture set up an environment in which violence is discouraged? I mean, to me, it's kind of interesting because a lot of anarchists will acknowledge that a lot of violent crime is a product of social conditions which anarchism seeks to eradicate. Once anarchism eradicates those conditions, violent crime, if not extinct, which is unlikely, will at least be overwhelmingly reduced, which I strongly believe. Could we not say then that likewise there is much less incentive in a society which prioritizes passive resistance and non-peaceful resistance? There is much less motivation, if as long as people are sufficiently involved, to enact violence politically and violent regime change themselves. Certainly, if the environment changes and the culture changes, that has to have an effect. But I think it's also about setting up a system in which people feel like they are able to participate adequately. And as we know from the history of the USSR, all of the internal squabbles and divisions, of which there were many, particularly in the, say, the 20s and 30s, arose from people feeling like a lack of participation, or feeling a lack of participation, or that their voice wasn't heard, or that they needed to be better or more broader decision-making processes involving more people. And unfortunately, Stalin's response to that seems to have been to simply keep on restricting the amount of democratic involvement rather than enlarging that. And I believe we saw exactly the same in the Maoist era, where Mao kind of opened, or seemingly opened, the door to 1,000 dissenting voices, and then slammed it very shut and said, now we know who all the troublemakers are, right? I don't think the answer is more constraint. I think it's less constraint, more participation. So I strongly agree with you then. I think there's good merit in your case, and I think it's supported by classical anarchist writings. And I think that the interdependence of individuals is what's really important, because I think the more people are interdependent, the less reason they have for that violence. And that's why, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm an anarcho-mutualist. And that is why I regard the authoritarian socialist regimes as potential powder kegs, because that interdependence simply isn't there. Instead, you have hierarchical systems. And from my perspective, authoritarian hierarchical systems inevitably produce violence, because people don't have an avenue for anything else. And I mean, that's something that classical protesters have always said. Martin Luther King's like, well, what do you expect people to do? To start throwing rocks? What do you expect them to do? They don't have a vote, and you already shut up all these avenues. What do you expect them to do?
No, that's a really good point, and I think that should be made clear also in response to the racist politician Rasmus Paludan, who wanted to burn the Quran.
Exactly.
No, I think also it's important to say that, well, that might have something to do with the collapse of the Soviet Union also, because when you have this kind of centralized, authoritarian, hierarchical society where everything depends on the top, everything depends on Moscow, then it's also quite, when Moscow decides that, well, we don't want to keep being socialist, we want to develop in another direction, there it's very vulnerable to a figure like Boris Yeltsin. So there's a component to that as well, that it's not very resilient as a strategy. Now, I think it's important to say that, well, the general strike also has a very mixed track record. Like, it's not been a tactic that's has been super successful in all the instances where it's been tried, and one of the reasons for that is that repression has been too harsh. I find one venue where nonviolence becomes a bit unreliable is that, well, if you try a general strike, if that general strike is attacked, how do you respond to that? Wouldn't you have to defend yourself? Maybe, and wouldn't it be good to know that even Christian anarchists are trustworthy comrades who will help defend the general strike? Maybe, but then again, if you look at the track record of defending violent repression of general strikes, well, that's terrible. It doesn't really. There's very few
Right.
cases where
That's right.
I don't know of any case where defending a general strikes lead to revolution, or where defending a general strike would be successful. Uh, of course, there are examples where general strikes have reached goals, but not a general strike that is trying to defend itself against overwhelming state violence.
Yeah,
So,
correct. Yeah.
and that's something. If you want to keep developing the general strike as a tactic, you would really need to think about, well, how could general strikes as a tactic, how could that be made resilient? How could that work for achieving goals and even changing society and the way societies governed or constituted? How can that lead to a permanent liberation of people? And I think that's also connected to other points that we have been discussing. That, well, why not start now? Why not start building resilient societies in the
Yes.
here and now? Uh, and that's all. That's sort of work that I'm trying to get involved with now, and I'm trying to develop. That the most important thing to do is develop resilient societies, resilient local societies with the capacity to affect change, with the capacity to sustain themselves, and with the capacity to protect themselves to some extent. So basically, I think the state is not going to go away for a long time, but the state could be marginalized in a much larger extent. And I think
Right.
also that will be helped by the process right now of states pulling back in many cases. So in Sweden right now, we have a relatively well-functioning state. It's a very wealthy state, but you see that the will of wealthy taxpayers to fund, for example, areas like the area where I live, which is the countryside, far north, and which is historically quite poor and far from the center. The willingness of wealthy taxpayers to fund welfare where I live is decreasing. So there are some people who are actively saying that, well, we should basically let everything outside of Stockholm be and left to its own devices, because that area should not be developed, because that's not where the money is being made. And that is basically saying that, well, the state shouldn't be there. We shouldn't care if the state is present in these areas. And that creates a vacuum where I think it's important to mobilize and organize. So, for example, where the city where I live, the hospital is being shut down or gradually shut down. There's and many functions from the hospitals are being centralized, and that opens up an opportunity to build resilient civil society that steps in and takes charge instead of the government over those functions. And I think that's very much in line with an anarchist mutualist perspective
Definitely.
of
Yeah.
building societies that care for themselves.
Right.
And then again, when you come to a conflict, if you have that kind of society and you say that, well, we're not going to suffer this, we're not going to stand for this, we're going to withhold our labor, what is the state going to do? People are already feeding themselves, taking care of themselves, uh, treating their own illnesses. What is left for the state to do? Well, the only thing that the state still has is a capacity for violence.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
So that's and the next question is then, well, we need to prepare for that too. And what are the best methods to prepare for that repression and that violence, given the circumstances that we face?
Yeah. So the concept there that you mentioned is of dual power structures, whereby members of a hierarchical authoritarian society, or at least hierarchical society, well, all of them are authoritarian by definition, but members of that
Mm,
society develop their own systems and structures which substitute for, at least significantly, or at least in part, if not entirely replace, existing state services, such that if those state
yes.
services are withheld, then the individuals are at least marginally affected, if not completely unaffected.
Mm,
So the idea is that you're reducing people's vulnerability to the state by
mm,
replacing the state services on which they necessarily depend. And ironically, I think that there are ways forward for that. I think that potential for that is going to increase if, as some governments are now at least seeing the potential for, or the importance of, there's a greater encouragement of decentralization of producing electricity, right? Which seems like such a small thing, but as you can imagine, if governments start thinking, the more we decentralize electricity production, the better off it's going to be. Partly we can shift the responsibility to these local communities, which then produce them in less polluting ways, ideally. And frankly, electricity, if it's coming from the state, is a massive hold over you. Or obviously from a private corporation, likewise. So I think that there is potential in this ways. And I mean, I'm not talking just about people putting up solar panels on their roofs. I'm talking literally about the potential for, and again, this is a controversial issue, but frankly, limited small modular fission reactors in local communities, which could produce enormous amounts of power for a local community and make them functionally independent of a state grid or private grid. I think, just as an aside, I think we took a very bad turn against nuclear in the late 70s and early 80s. You probably remember it yourself. Oh, you might not remember it. Sorry, I'm not sure how old you are. I definitely remember it.
No, I'm born 87, so I'm
Yeah.
born just after Chernobyl catastrophe.
It was even before that. In the 80s, the Greens joined hands with the fossil fuel lobby to protest against. In fact, even the Greens were even protesting against hydropower. That's how wacky things were in the 80s, successfully too. But yeah, that's an aside. But I think there's a lot of potential for things like that, and I think if anarchists looked at some of these mission critical or cornerstone services, medical care, power production, this kind of thing, you could see the enormous potential for significant liberation of communities from the state. And I don't think these are theoretical either. To a very large extent, these are really possible. And even if you say, well, on a small scale, perhaps, but on a small scale can be replicated. And if they're replicable, then you don't just have a small scale anymore. We're not just talking about switching everybody over in the entire nation, but if we have enough sufficiently independent communities in a city, those people have a significant independence from the state. And of course, it's the vulnerabilities to state services, which is ironically part of that, the Faustian bargain, which keeps even the most hardened of activists in line. And yeah, it is a Faustian bargain because on the one hand, as leftists, we encourage the government to extend social services, whilst on the other hand, we realize that this does increase our vulnerability to the state. So that concept
But
of
that's
dual
also
powers
very
is critical.
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to react to one point that what the state often has done is to take initiatives from civil society and from essentially workers and socialize them or authoritarianize them.
Yeah, I think that's a good
so
point. Yeah.
employment boards, mutual or social insurance, and so on. A lot of these functions have been developed by civil society and developed by workers and then co-opted by the state.
Yes, that's right. That's
So I think co-opting them back, especially when the state is pulling back their initiative, would be a very good strategy.
Right.
What we need to be aware of in the future is that we can't let the state co-opt them again.
Yes, that's right.
That's something we need to defend these institutions from the state.
Yeah, and I think the Black Panthers did a very good job of that in a lot of ways.
Yes.
And I think they're a great example. Actually, ironically, I was going to mention the Black Panthers. For all their ferocious reputation, I think you could legitimately argue that the Black Panthers were a great example of non-violent resistance. Precisely because they did have a pretty strong policy of self-defense. And when there were reactionaries who did take more active steps to oppose the US government with literally violent actions like bombings of federal buildings, etc., the Black Panthers explicitly distanced themselves from them. They had very harsh criticism for the Weatherman movement that you might be aware of, and called them.
No, I didn't know. I didn't
Oh,
know. That's super interesting.
yeah, it's very interesting actually. I looked into it myself because when I was looking into the whole question of how violent the Black Panthers really were, and I found that actually a lot of the implication that they were this revolutionary violent movement trying to overthrow the government was, unsurprisingly, propaganda from their enemies. And they explicitly stated that they considered the Weatherman movement to be reckless, and that they thought this was not helping anyone, and that they were focused primarily on the good that they could do in their own communities. So they had, the food services they provided, and the assistance to, getting kids to school. I mean, these kind of local neighborhood services, they're literally dual power systems. And that made their local communities far more robust, far more well integrated with themselves, and reduced their dependence on the state. And we know that those breakfast clubs were considered a far greater threat by the government than the Weathermen were, ironically.
No, I can imagine, because that also shows the government. That shows that the government is unnecessary.
Exactly, and I think that's
If
brilliant,
people
because
can
they say,
arrange social services and
we don't even
security
need
for
to
themselves,
fight you. We just replace you.
no, yeah, we just make you irrelevant and don't
Exactly.
care about you.
And I think that that's a
Of
very
course, and
underrated aspect of their work, and I think it feeds
yeah,
very well into exactly what you were saying before.
yeah. And by using, for example, mutual aid as a method instead of creating alternative economies, or you do create alternative economies, but not necessarily a monetary economy, but
Right.
maybe based on a trust economy and so on, you can't tax that.
Yes. Yeah. Very
You
good point.
can't
Yes.
tax trust.
Right.
So that's also one thing that you could do, which would undermine the authority of the state.
Yes. And their own community protection services effectively
Mm,
replacing the police, which were obviously
mm,
not doing them any good. So yeah, I think they're an understudied example, and I think that the mythology which has been built
mm,
around them has been very much to their disservice. I do want to make a video on
mm,
the Black Panthers, in particular the shift in their political views, which has been very
mm,
interesting to read about, how they moved
mm,
from this kind of nascent anti-racist movement at the start, and then uh,
mm,
across to uh, a kind of a black nationalism, and then Marxist
mm,
Leninism, and then a kind of a Marxist Leninist Maoism, and then finally to
mm,
a kind of an international socialism. The
mm,
movement, their ideological movement, was actually quite dramatic if viewed over time. And I think that's really quite
mm,
interesting, because those people were real thinkers. They were evaluating systems, they were
mm,
trying out what worked. Fundamentally, they were always absolutely practical, which I really admire.
mm,
But they were
mm,
self-critical of their own ideology, and as they said, we held this line for a while, and then we regarded it, but I had that it had its usefulness to us had expired, or we realized that it
mm,
just couldn't do what we wanted to do more. We'd reached this point, and we
mm,
needed another tool now. And I think that's really
mm,
healthy. I think that's really admirable.
mm,
So I do want to do a video on the Black Panthers from, or maybe a couple
mm,
from that perspective. I think there's a lot to learn from there,
mm, mm.
particularly with regard to that
I
dual
think
power issue.
I think in order to succeed there, it would be helpful to develop some structures for professional anarchists,
Yes, yes,
so that
definitely.
you don't need to rely on jobs
Yes,
from capitalists or public service jobs
right.
in order to survive and
Yes,
sustain yourself, but rather that you could work within the movement, and that the movement could um, guarantee your income and living, so to
right,
say.
right, exactly. Yep.
But that's also controversial, because that would need,
Yeah,
I mean, at
I was
least in
thinking
the
about
start, that
that.
would
It
mean,
can sound a bit like a vanguard party, or just another kind of
yeah,
uh, socialist elite, right?
or within the, yeah, or you could face the criticism of, well, you're just exploiting yourselves within the capitalist
Yeah, well, that's
system
a good point too. Actually,
instead of
conversely,
taking
it
over
would
the
make those
system.
people more vulnerable
yeah.
to others. Yeah,
But then again, I think these kinds of criticisms are things you have to live with, and you have
yeah,
to take them in and evaluate them, and
right.
so on. Yeah.
And
So
some things you're just
basically, I
going to have to
think
try and see how they work.
yeah, and I think that's really interesting because when you take in what Stefan and Chenoweth are saying, when you're studying their work as part of a bigger discussion and not the end all answer, then you start asking questions, which are very helpful. You start evaluating movements again and learning from. And I mean, you could learn from. I think also a helpful example of movements that have taken uh, lessons and learned from the failed experiments in the USSR and so on are Rojava and the
Right,
Zapatistas,
definitely, yes.
which are not ideological purists, but they
Mm.
have developed revolution in a different way
Yes,
than
yes,
the classical revolutionary movement.
absolutely.
So learning from those, and I think there you could also start asking questions based on the work by Stefan and Chenoweth, and you can take in different sources. You evaluate the Black Panthers again, and you start asking questions about how the movement should evolve and what that means for your activism work in your local community.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, very good. Yeah. Well, I'm enormously grateful to the time that you've taken out of your day to do this, in view of the fact that you have family commitments. And I found this a really enlightening and productive discussion. I think our viewers will as well. It's really enlightened me with regard to Chenoweth and Stefan's work and given me some ideas about developing this further for some future videos.
Mm,
And I
mm,
think it's kind of rekindled my interest in looking at the Black Panther movement in particular again.
mm,
So yeah, I'm really grateful for that. I do think you should write up your paper and submit it to an anarchist journal. I think it would be extremely valuable, really, because I haven't seen Chenoweth and Stefan's paper discussed much in anarchist literature.
mm,
Maybe I'm looking in the wrong places,
mm,
but it seems to me to be something that is of particular relevance to anarchists. So
mm,
I'm kind of surprised about that,
mm,
except for, of course, Peter's criticism, which obviously has
mm,
definitely done the rounds. But I think that
mm,
his paper tends to stifle the discussion because he's such
mm,
a highly regarded figure. I've seen discussions on
mm,
Reddit where somebody has raised Chenoweth's paper, and then somebody says, "Okay,
mm.
yeah, Peter already answered that," bang,
Yeah,
and then
yeah,
it just terminates
yeah,
the discussion, which is
yeah.
exactly the opposite of what
And
you were talking about.
No, I agree. And I also think if I'm also very happy that you asked me to join. It was delightful to have this conversation, and it definitely helped my thinking process. So I'm very happy with that.
Mm,
I think I want to say to people who are more involved or more invested in the ideas of nonviolence and pacifism
right.
than me or you seem to be, that what I would ask you or urge you to do is just read the literature and submit your own comments and start answering the criticisms, and uh, don't stick to talking points,
Mm.
but add to the conversation and develop new theories and strategies and try them out primarily.
Maybe I'll write a paper on the Black Panthers and with regard to Chenoweth and Stefan's work and submit that. That could be good.
That would be super interesting. Yeah, I'll consider writing a paper from my essay. It would be really interesting
That would be great. I definitely
for
going
sure.
to. I definitely going to look at. I want to do a big study of this uh, idea that I have seen in the literature of Marxist Leninist political institutions being fundamentally unstable because of this
Mm,
built-in idea of, or as I said in crude terms, the legitimization of political violence as
mm,
a regime change tool. But yeah, that's going to take a little bit more time, I think.
mm. No, of
Okay,
course. And yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, been a delight. And honestly, this is probably the second or third time that I've actually had to speak personally with somebody who's actually a subscriber to my channel, which is enormously exciting because I'm just a tiny little channel, and I really appreciate that. I really like the fact that you were so
Yeah.
engaged with that you contributed like this to me. Yeah, it really gave me a vista to look at in terms of this subject, which is enormously helpful and really got me thinking on this, and really has helped me condense a lot of things and save me a lot of time, frankly, when I come to revisiting Chenoweth and Stefan's work. I feel like I've got much better understanding of it. And that sense that I had, that kind of vague sense that I had of like something fuzzy about this number, I'm not sure what it is. You've helped clear that up for me a lot. And I think that, as
Okay,
I've mentioned
perfect.
before, that the mythology of the paper or their work has,
Mm,
kind of transcended the actual message, which is far more subtle.
very good.
Great.
Okay,
Thanks a lot.
let's stay in touch and
Yeah, we'll
take
do.
care.
Thanks very much. Bye bye.
Sure. Thank you. Bye.
Finally, I'd like to thank my generous patrons: Elias Asvig, June Barnett, Alexander Curzon, Sean A. Young, Andy Chaos, TBLTP, Niels Rethlin, Matthew Simmerall, Thomas Leonard, Martin T., Ben Lindquist, John Larkin, Love You More, Noah French, Aaron Johnson, Emily Cougar, David Johnson, Be the Heretic, Sean M., Waymore Odhi, and Dusty Bob. Thank you so much for your support, and please contact me if I ever pronounce your name incorrectly.